You know how sometimes you hear about these huge historical events, think you get the gist.
Yeah, the headlines, the main players, maybe.
Exactly. But then you start digging just a little, and wow, there's this like whole other layer of detail, complexity.
It's always way deeper than it first appears.
Well, that's what we're doing today. We're taking a proper deep dive into the Medellin cartel. We've gone through, a bunch of sources, historical accounts, news articles from back then, academic papers,
All sorts, yeah.
to really try and grasp what made this organization work, where it came from, how it operated, the sheer impact, and how it eventually fell apart.
And the scale, I mean, when you look at the sources, it's genuinely mind-boggling. They were claiming, what, 80% of the world's cocaine supply at their peak?
80%. It's almost hard to picture.
It really is. And the money, reports talk about upwards of $200 million.
Daily.
That's,
That's staggering.
yeah, that kind of cash isn't just about personal wealth. It warps economies. It destabilizes things. It's crucial to keep that level of influence in mind as we go through this.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. How did this all get going? Our sources really point to Medellin, Colombia, around 1976. That seems to be the key year.
Right, and the name everyone knows is obviously Pablo Escobar. But the sources are clear, he wasn't acting alone, not by a long shot.
No, it was a core group, wasn't it? Like Jorge Ochoa Vasquez, his brothers Juan and Fabio, Jose Rodriguez Gacha.
Aaron Carlos later, too, yeah.
Okay.
They formed this kind of founding partnership.
Now, Escobar, he'd been involved in, let's say, other illicit activities before 76. Smuggling, contraband.
Yeah, the sources mention some pretty wild stuff, stealing tombstones, cars, even kidnappings, apparently. But 76 looks like the pivot point.
The moment cocaine trafficking became the main focus.
Exactly. Driven by that, well, exploding demand for it, particularly in the U.S. That was a
Yeah.
huge market opening up.
And looking at those early days, it wasn't just the top guys, was it? There were key figures emerging in supporting roles.
Oh, definitely. The sources consistently highlight Gustavo Gaviria Escobar's cousin. He seems to have been the logistics guy, really understood how to move the product efficiently,
The nuts and bolts of it all.
pretty much. And then you've got Roberto Escobar, Pablo's brother. He was the accountant. Can you imagine trying to keep track of those amounts of cash?
Unbelievable. So Gaviria handling logistics, Roberto the money. But how did they actually get the cocaine into the U.S. market so effectively early on?
Ah, well, that's where Carlos later and an American named George Jung come in. Our sources really stress their importance, even if their direct partnership wasn't super long.
Right, they were kind of the bridge.
Yeah, they set up crucial distribution networks stateside. Leader even established that famous hub on Norman's Cay in the Bahamas.
Oh, yeah, I've read about that, like a private transit point.
Exactly. And this Letter-Young connection, roughly 76 to 78, some sources argue it was so effective it basically kicked off America's whole cocaine era.
Wow. So they essentially paved the way for the massive flow that followed.
That seems to be the argument. Yeah, they provided that vital link between the Colombian supply and the American demand.
And as those profits started rolling in, that's when we see the shift, right? From
Yeah.
maybe more separate smuggling operations
To the cartel structure. Yeah. Around 76 to 79, you see this consolidation, bringing in the Ochoa brothers more formally, Rodriguez Gacha.
Mhm.
It was about pooling resources, maximizing profits, and solidifying control.
Makes sense. Power in numbers and shared risk, I suppose.
And shared profits, which were becoming enormous.
And the scale they reached. I mean, the sources describe smuggling tons of cocaine, multiple tons every single week.
Billions of dollars a year in revenue. It's almost abstract, the numbers are so big.
And not just Colombia, right? Their operations spread out.
Oh, yeah, hugely. Centered in Antioquia, around Medellin, sure. But tentacles reached into Bolivia, Panama, Central America, Peru, the Bahamas, obviously.
And then into the U.S., big time. L.A., New York, Miami, even Canada gets mentioned.
A truly vast network.
Yeah.
And the methods they used to move the product.
Yeah.
Some were quite ingenious, others just desperate.
Like what do the sources mention?
Well, you have cocaine packed into pellets, people swallowing condoms or balloons filled with the mules.
Right, the human couriers. Very risky.
Extremely. And then on a larger scale, Cessna planes doing clandestine drops, avoiding radar, using remote airstrips.
They must have had sophisticated ways to avoid getting caught, too.
Definitely. The sources talk about counter-surveillance, monitoring law enforcement, using decoys, diversion tactics. They became very adept at that.
It just shows the scale of the operation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That stat you mentioned earlier, by 1982, cocaine surpassing coffee.
Yeah, as Colombia's main export. Think about that. It fundamentally warped the national economy.
So you have this incredibly wealthy, powerful criminal organization, but then things take a darker, more political turn.
They do. And according to the sources, the main driver for this shift towards political violence was one specific thing: extradition.
The fear of being sent to the U.S. for trial.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
terrified them. They knew their money and intimidation tactics wouldn't work the same way in the American justice system.
So that led to Los Extraditables.
Correct. That became their sort of militant slogan
Hmm.
and also the name associated with their campaign against the state. It was about fighting extradition using any means necessary.
Which meant bombings, kidnapping.
And all that. And targeted assassinations. The sources list a chilling number of high-profile figures killed because they supported extradition or were seen as threats.
Like who? Can you give some examples?
Well, there was the Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, killed in '84, Police Colonel Jaime Ramirez Gomez in '86, the director of the El Espectador newspaper, Guillermo Cano Izaiza, also
It's
'86,
just for doing their jobs, essentially.
pretty much. Then the Attorney General, Carlos Mauro Hoyos, in '88, the governor of Antioquia, Antonio Roldan Betancur, in '89, and, numerous judges, police officers, anyone who represented the state's push for extradition.
It paints a picture of a country almost under siege by this one organization.
It really does. The level of intimidation was immense.
And then there's that whole controversial episode with the M19 guerrillas and the Palace of Justice siege in '85. What did the sources say about the cartel's involvement there?
It's complex, and the accounts conflict, actually. Some sources at the time definitely suggested the cartel funded or encouraged the M19 attack, hoping to, destroy extradition records held at the Supreme Court and intimidate the judges.
Plausible given their motive.
Plausible, yes. But other sources argue against it, pointing out that the cartel and M19 had previously been enemies. M19 had even kidnapped people close to the cartel. So the relationship was murky, definitely not a straightforward alliance. It highlights how messy these situations can get.
It's interesting, too, comparing Escobar's approach to violence with the Cali cartel, who became their rivals.
Yeah, the sources draw a contrast there. Initially, at least, the Cali guys preferred bribery, influence. They saw violence as bad for business, a last resort.
There's that quote, isn't there? Something like,
Dead people do not pay what they owe. Yeah, it's a very pragmatic, almost business-like view of crime compared to Escobar's readiness to use brute force and terror.
two different philosophies of criminal enterprise, maybe.
You could say that. Cali was playing the long game, perhaps, while Escobar often seemed focused on immediate intimidation and control through fear.
So as the violence ramps up, opposition starts to build, right? Not just from the government.
Absolutely. And one key group the sources discuss is Huerta Secuestradores, MAS. That's the kidnappers.
Who were they initially?
It started as this kind of unlikely alliance. The Medellin Cartel, the Cali Cartel, other wealthy landowners, business elites, they were all being targeted by leftist guerrilla groups for kidnapping and extortion.
Ah, so a common enemy brought them together, especially after figures like Carlos Later and Marta Ochoa were kidnapped by guerrillas.
Exactly. It was initially a self-defense, vigilante-style response to the kidnappings.
But it didn't stay that way.
No. According to the sources, Escobar increasingly pumped money into MAS and basically started using it for his own purposes, turning it into more of a personal paramilitary force to fight his battles.
So it evolved from defense against guerrillas to another tool for the cartel.
Largely, yes, particularly under Escobar's influence.
And then there was another group, Los Pepes.
Right. Los Pepes,
Yeah.
people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This group was crucial in the final stages.
Who are they made up of?
A real mix, apparently. Enemies Escobar had made over the years, former associates he'd double-crossed or fallen out with. And significantly, the sources say they were heavily financed by the rival Cali cartel.
So the Cali cartel funding a group to take down Escobar.
Seems like it. And Los Pepes were absolutely brutal. They used the same kind of violent tactics against Escobar's network, his family, his lawyers, his properties.
Fighting fire with fire, essentially.
Very much so. Their campaign caused huge damage to Escobar's organization from within and put immense pressure on him, alongside the government's efforts. It shows how internal rivalries and betrayals can be just as deadly as external law enforcement pressure.
Turning to the political side again, beyond Colombia, did the cartel have connections with other governments? The sources mention a few places.
Yeah, there are allegations discussed in the sources, links with the Sandinista government in Nicaragua for protection, allegedly,
Okay.
working with Manuel Noriega's regime in Panama for money laundering and facilitating shipment.
Soriego, right. That connection came out later.
And even suggestions, though perhaps more contentious, about using Cuba as a transit point. Some sources allege this happened with the knowledge of the Castro government, possibly in exchange for weapons, especially as Soviet aid to Cuba was drying up.
Interesting. It highlights how these operations really cross borders and involve complex, sometimes shadowy alliances.
Definitely. It's about finding safe havens, logistical help, places to wash money, wherever they could find a partner, willing or coerced.
But underpinning so much of their conflict with governments, especially Colombia's, was that extradition treaty with the U.S.
Absolutely central. That fear, that existential threat of facing trial in the U.S. drove so much of the violence, the bombings, the assassinations. It was the one thing they seemed to fear most.
Because their power base in Colombia wouldn't protect them there.
Exactly. Their ability to bribe or intimidate wouldn't carry the same weight. Extradition meant losing control.
Which brings us to the end game, the downfall in the early 90s. The manhunt for Escobar himself intensified massively.
Hugely. Led by the Colombian National Police's elite unit, the Search Block. And they had significant help from the U.S. intelligence support, tech, even personnel from Delta Force and the CIA are mentioned in the sources.
It became a huge international effort.
It did. And after, 16 months on the run, they finally tracked him down. December 2nd, 1993, in Medellin.
How did they find him? The sources mention a phone call.
Yeah, ironically, it was a call he made to his family, his son, Juan Pablo. The authorities had triangulation technology. They traced the call, pinpointed his location in a middle-class neighborhood.
And the actual death. There's still some debate about how it happened, isn't there?
There is. The official account is that he and his bodyguard were killed in a shootout while trying to escape across rooftops. But there's always been this counter-narrative, pushed by his family among others, that he actually shot himself.
Committed suicide to avoid capture and that dreaded extradition.
That's the claim. Hard to know for sure, but the official finding was killed by authorities. Either way, his death was a massive turning point.
The end of an era, really. But his legacy is complicated, isn't it?
Very. Responsible for incredible violence and suffering. But some sources also note this Robin Hood image he cultivated in parts of Medellin.
Through building housing projects, football fields.
Exactly. Philanthropy funded by drug money. But for some poor communities, he was seen as a benefactor. The sheer number of people, thousands, who reportedly attended his funeral, speaks to that complexity.
So Escobar's gone. What happened to the rest of the cartel structure?
Well, the hunt continued for his key lieutenants, and Los Pepes were heavily involved in targeting them too, alongside the authorities. Plus, the USDEA's kingpin strategy, focusing on taking out the top leadership, is cited as a key factor in dismantling the organization's hierarchy.
Did anything rise up to take its place immediately?
The sources mention the Oficina de Envigado. It apparently started as an enforcement wing for the Medellin Cartel, but sort of morphed and outlasted Escobar, taking over some of the territory and criminal rackets. A partial successor, you might say.
And of course, the story itself lives on massively in popular culture.
Oh, absolutely. Books, movies, and especially TV shows like Narcos. The fascination with the story, the scale, the personality. It hasn't really faded.
So summing up this deep dive, we've seen this, unprecedented rise of a drug trafficking organization to global dominance.
Fueled by huge demand, run with ruthless efficiency, and incredible innovation in some ways.
Then the shift into brutal political violence, mainly fighting that extradition threat.
Yeah, and the complex mix of forces that rose against them, the state, rival cartels like Cali, internal enemies forming groups like Los Pepes.
It all came together to eventually bring the organization down, culminating in Escobar's death.
These sources, taken together, they really offer a powerful, often disturbing look into how something like this could happen and the immense consequences it had.
Consequences still felt today, undoubtedly.
Which really leaves us with a big question for you, the listener, to think about. Considering that incredible wealth, that almost state-like power the Medellin Cartel achieved, what do you think were the truly critical factors in its collapse?
Was it mainly the law enforcement pressure, both Colombian and international?
Or was it the internal rot, the betrayals, the sheer number of enemies Escobar made, groups like Los Pepes turning his own tactics against him?
Or is there something just inherently unstable about an empire built on that level of violence and illegality?
And beyond its collapse, what's the lasting impact? On Colombia, yes, but also on the global drug trade and the fight against it. Something definitely worth pondering as you reflect on what we've discussed from these sources.
Absolutely. We'd encourage you to look deeper into the sources or related materials if this dive has sparked your interest. It's a complex piece of history with lessons that still resonate.